At the beginning of the 20th century, some of the leading non-subscribers were quite concerned. They were expressing concerns that congregations had become quite isolated from one another. Of course, there were the structures, the Remonstrant Synod, the Presbytery of Antrim, the Synod of Munster, and the overarching association by which they could cooperate. But there was a feeling that individual congregations were a little bit stranded. And so moves were begun to see how this might be ameliorated, really. And it's really interesting to look at how this happened. The first move was to introduce a journal. And the journal, or magazine, is of course called the Non-Subscribing Presbyterian. Some people have wanted to shorten that title and call the magazine the Non-Subscriber. That would probably have been a step too far at that time, because McGuinness had in fact edited an earlier journal for the Radicals, which was called exactly that. So the title, the Non-Subscribing Presbyterian, was chosen. And the journal is described in its early issues as just being that, just as a mechanism for letting congregations know about one another and bringing people up to date with what's happening and drawing people together a bit more. And it says that there is absolutely no other agenda, but I think that there were moves afoot behind the scenes. Because in 1910, what we find, of course, is the denomination actually being formed. And this is described in the magazine in a very interesting way. It's exceptionally low-key. We have a description of the meeting of the Remonstrant Synod, a description of the meeting of the Presbytery of Antrim, and then a little description, blink and you'd miss it almost, about the founding of the new denomination. And it was all done in a very quiet and measured way, I think. And one of the things that's really, really interesting to look at is the way that the different congregations describe themselves. There's no stated position put forward. So the different congregations begin to write little congregational reports about themselves, or perhaps to advertise. And they identify in different ways. So for instance, Killinshi at this time identifies as a remonstrant congregation. So what it's doing really is emphasising the right to freedom of opinion, freedom of thought, freedom of expression, the right to remonstrate, the right not to be compelled to subscribe. On the other hand, First Church at this time is describing itself as Presbyterian. So it's placing its emphasis on the democratic system of governance, different emphasis. And Moneyreagh itself, and also Mount Pottinger, for example, at this time are defining themselves as Unitarian. So the emphasis is on radical theology, really. And there is no attempt to assimilate this. The different congregations are simply left to describe themselves in different ways, with the emphasis again being on drawing people together and opening up a mechanism for greater communication. The Synod of Munster in 1910 doesn't choose to join the denomination, and that's because although it was sufficiently theologically flexible to accommodate all the opinions in the north at that time, the Synod of Munster had a more radical theology still, and it took time for arrangements to be put in place and special measures to be introduced to allow the Synod of Munster the degree of flexibility and theological expression, I suppose we might put it, that they required. And they joined in the mid-1930s. In 1935 they too came into the denomination. So we have the Remonstrant Synod, the Presbytery of Antrim, and the Synod of Munster at this stage within the denomination. The association is no longer required, and at the beginning of the 1940s it is abandoned, it dissolves itself. Now, when the Remonstrant Synod was founded back in 1830, it had 4 presbyteries. The Presbytery of Strabane, which was very small and which disappeared actually relatively quickly in the course of the 19th century. The Presbytery of Armagh, which had become unviable really by 1913, and at that point it was united with the Presbytery of Bangor, and the Presbytery of Templepatrick, along with the Presbytery of Bangor. So by the time of the First World War, for instance, the Remonstrant Synod has 2 presbyteries, the Presbytery of Templepatrick and the Presbytery of Bangor. By the 1950s, the Presbytery of Templepatrick became non-viable. People were looking into this and were very concerned about how pulpits would be supplied and what should be done. But the thing is, remember that although they're now brought together within the one denomination, the Remonstrant Synod and the Presbytery of Antrim have different histories and different internal administrative structures, we might put it, certainly for the disbursement of finances. And so what is talked about is how to support the Presbytery of Templepatrick. And McCleary of Dunmurry Reverend McCleary of Dunmurry comes up with a remarkably ingenious solution. And a proposal is put at that stage that the congregations of the Presbytery of Antrim should be accepted into the Remonstrant Synod. So there isn't actually a formal merger. The Remonstrant Synod and the Presbytery of Antrim can continue to have their own identities and can continue their own traditions and the rights of the different congregations. But a mechanism is found for supporting the Presbytery of Templepatrick. And once the merger is effected, Templepatrick and Antrim merge as a presbytery. And so this is how the Remonstrant Synod from then on becomes apparently the Presbytery of Antrim and the Presbytery of Bangor. But it's done in this very subtle and clever way at that time. And this is where we're going to end our chronology in the middle of the 1950s, our quick romp, I suppose, through the history of Irish non-subscription. But what we're going to do next, Reverend Chris Wilson has asked me to look in a little more detail at some theological aspects of the traditions of the denomination. And so next time, we're going to go back to the Creed of an Arian, to Montgomery's Declaration of Faith, and have a closer look at that.